So today we're going to talk about something that we get a lot of questions about. It's about loudness. How do you make things loud? That's a fairly common question when it comes to mastering, and I have prepared two examples here that we're going to have a listen to. These are both made from the same mix, but it's two different masters. And we're going to listen to them now, and I want you to hear which one of them sounds loudest, which one is the louder master. I think it should be fairly obvious that the first one, the top one, is the louder master. But you might be surprised to learn that if we analyze the loudness of these two, then we will see that they both have the same loudness, the same measured loudness. They are both -8 LUFS. And also the rest of the measurements are also very similar. They are pretty much identical when it comes to the measured loudness. So how is this possible? Well, that's the subject of this video. When I was starting out mastering more than 20 years ago, I had no idea how to make a loud master. That was something that I really wanted to know how to do, because I heard all these professionally mastered records and they were all loud at that time. And I had a chance to sit in on a session with a very experienced mastering engineer, so I asked the question, how do you make a loud master? And the answer was kind of surprising, but very obvious when you think about it. He just said, well, you turn the level up. And then he showed me, he turned the level up, he was working all analog, and I said, but doesn't that make everything clip? And he said, yes, it does, just make sure that it sounds good. So then I realized that it doesn't really matter if things are clipping or peaking. What really matters is how does it sound. And back then we mainly used AD clipping as peak limiting. The mastering chain was mostly analog, and we got the loudness, the level, from clipping the AD converter on the way into the DAW. Nowadays we have better peak limiters. I rarely use clipping nowadays, but it's still the same principle. First you make it sound good, and then you increase the level, and then you will get some artifacts from that. So then you go back and make it sound good again. And then you repeat that until it sounds as loud as you want it to sound. And as it turns out, it's actually quite easy to make something sound pretty loud, as long as it sounds good to begin with. If you want to make it crazy loud, then there are some additional difficulties. But if you just want to make it moderately loud, then it's actually that easy. The difficult part in all of this is to make it sound good. That's usually where most of us will need to spend the most time. And that is also the key to making a loud master. So what is good sound then? How do we know when things sounds good? Well, in my view, this basically comes down to three aspects of the sound. We have the tonal balance, we have transient clarity, and we have dynamics. So let's discuss these three things. We'll start with the tonal balance. This is probably the most important aspect of a mix. Is there enough bass? Is there too much bass? Is there enough high end? Is there enough mids? Are there areas in the frequency range that are congested, or are there problematic areas where there is ringing or build-ups that makes it difficult to listen to the master? All of this is connected to the tonal balance of the master. The second important aspect is the transient clarity. Transients are the onsets of the sounds within the mix, and transients are very important for recognizing different sounds and makes it possible to hear the individual instruments within a mix. If the transients are unclear or buried in the mix, then the mix will tend to sound muddy or unengaging or seem to lack overall clarity. And the third important aspect of a mix or a master is the dynamics. And this is both the overall dynamics of the mix, the loud parts versus the quieter parts, But it's also about the more short-term dynamics, like for example the relationship between the kick and the snare in a mix. It can also be about dynamics in different frequency areas. And I would say that these three aspects, the tonal balance, the transient clarity, and the dynamics of the mix, these are the things that will make us decide whether we think the mix sounds good or if it doesn't sound good. And when we get these things in control, then it will usually be quite simple to add loudness to this. So if you have a master that sounds good and then you want to increase the level, the loudness of it, and you do that using a peak limiter, then there will be some artifacts that you will either tweak in the peak limiter itself, or you might want to counteract by tweaking earlier in the chain. So there will usually be a back and forth between making the master sound good and making it sound a bit louder. And for many years this was the thing that mastering engineers did all day. We made things sound loud while still sounding good. But nowadays there is really not that much pressure from clients to make masters sound loud, since most playback nowadays is done through streaming services with loudness normalization. So for example on Spotify, then most users will have loudness normalization enabled, because that's enabled by default, and then Spotify will automatically make all songs sound approximately at the same loudness when you listen to them. But this doesn't mean that we can just ignore loudness nowadays. We still need to make the master sound good. And if we go back to the example that we heard in the beginning of this video, as you might remember, both masters measured to exactly -8 LUFS. So according to the LUFS meter, these two masters are identical in loudness. But as you could hear, one of them sounded noticeably louder than the other. And what this means is that since they measured equally loud, then they will also be adjusted with the same amount when they are played back in a loudness normalized playback. So if you were to listen to these two songs on Spotify, then the first example would still sound louder than the second one, both if you listen with loudness normalization and if you listen without loudness normalization. The first one will always sound louder than the second one. And why is that? Well, it all comes down to these three big aspects of the sound that we talked about. It's the tonal balance, it's transient clarity, and it's dynamics. So if we start with tonal balance, for example, put on your headphones now and we'll have a listen to this. If you listen to the tonal balance when I switch between these two examples, then you can hear that they are quite different. Have a listen. I will open up an EQ. Let's have a listen. Especially if you listen to this area. This area is much more prominent in the first version than what it is in the second. And the thing with this mix is that the guitars are quite prominent in the 2K area, 1.5 kHz to 2 kHz area. And this area is very important for making these guitars stand out in the mix. In the first example, this area is quite fronted, it's quite prominent, while in the second example, this area is quite subdued. And this makes the guitars sound close and upfront in the first version, and sound distant and subdued in the second version. And if you also have a listen to the low end, then you will hear that the second version has a lot more low end as well. So if you listen to this area, then this is more prominent in the second version. So these two things combined makes the second version sound more muddy, more thick, and less upfront. And there's also some resonances in the lower mids. So if you listen to this area, this is more obvious in the second part here. This is much more in control in the first version. So these things combined makes the second version sound more distant, more muddy, more congested in the lower mids. And this kind of music is all about having the guitars up front and having everything sound snappy and clear. So this makes the first version sound more natural and more like we sort of anticipate that this kind of music would sound. And when it comes to transient clarity, you can listen to how the kick and the snare sounds in the two different versions. Listen to the snappiness of the kick and especially the snare. And this has a lot to do with limiter settings. In the first version, the limiter is set to a quite aggressive setting that keeps the transient clarity, while in the second version, the limiter is set to a much more soft setting that will reduce the transients, that will make the kick and snare sound less defined. And also, if you listen to how the dynamics sound in these two versions, then you will hopefully hear that the first version is more dynamic, while the second one is more compressed. It has a more squashed feeling. And they are both compressed. Both of these masters have compression on them, but the first one uses more sensible timings. The attack is longer and the release is shorter, which lets more of the drums through and adds a bit of density to the mix. While in the second version, then the attack is shorter and the release is longer, which makes the mix sound more compressed. It sounds more squashed. And it also has a bit of pumping in it. And you will find that the more you recognize that the tonal balance is off, or that you need more transient clarity, or that the mix is too compressed, or the master is too compressed, then it will be much more easy to find the right settings, because the difficulty is not knowing how to use a compressor or knowing how to use an EQ. These are things that are fairly easy to learn. You can learn how to use an EQ, how to use a compressor, how to use a peak limiter. The difficulty lies in hearing these things. But you will find that the more you practice this, the more you listen to things and notice these kinds of things, then the easier it will become to find the right settings. And hopefully you have found this video to be somewhat helpful in pointing out a few things to listen for. And if you want to learn more about mastering and are looking for somewhere to start, then I would recommend to have a look at our free PDF, 5 mastering strategies using free plugins. And it contains some really good information about how to get started mastering using free plugins. So go and have a look. You will find the link in the description. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.